loud. So I'm Fred Krupp, president of the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm going to have a few opening remarks, and then I'll be joined on the stage by Coral Davenport from the New York Times, and we will talk. I don't believe the United States or the world will do nearly enough, nearly fast enough, to hold temperature rise within safe levels. That's what Ezra Klein, a prominent journalist, said or wrote recently when he declared himself a climate pessimist. His concern is understandable and probably shared by some of you. After all, the science is scary, the politicians are polarized, and the impacts are increasing. Dangerous heat waves are becoming more frequent, and oceans have already risen by half a foot. Half of the summer Arctic sea ice has disappeared, and it could be all gone by the middle of this century. Someone being born today is likely to see temperatures rise by 2.5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit in their lifetimes, and likely to see the oceans become 80% more acidic. Anyone who is paying attention can see that we are in the race of our lives. But even with all that, I think the pessimists are wrong. So I'm here to offer 10 facts that suggest to me that we can galvanize action and get large-scale solutions back on track, not only here in America, but around the world. Now, this number 10, to be honest, that came from Dan Lashoff, a friend of mine who works with Tom Steyer at ClimateGen Solutions. He wrote a great blog that had 7 reasons, so, well, I just had to have 10. This optimism versus pessimism thing, you may think, who cares? It's really just an academic argument. But the question of whether you believe that we can solve this problem may in fact determine whether we can. Because if you don't have hope, why bother joining the effort to change the status quo and curb climate pollution? You might as well just have a glass of wine. With the United States losing today, there's another reason to have a glass of wine. So it's not an exaggeration to say that on the issue of climate change, both pessimism and optimism can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But optimism, of course, not based on facts, in the long run is worthless. So here are the facts. Now I'll start David Letterman style with the number 10 reason why I am optimistic that we can be successful. Solar and wind prices have declined dramatically. The price of solar panels has fallen 75% just since 2008. And the US added more solar capacity in the last 18 months than it last added in the previous 30 years combined. And wind power is now roughly cost competitive with both gas and coal power in many parts of the country. In fact, several times over the past year, wind provided more than 1/4 of the electricity in Texas. And now the number 9 reason. The American economy has moved in the right direction. There are fluctuations in this, and in fact there was an uptick last year, but the trend line of US emissions has been down. So from 2005 to 2013, carbon dioxide emissions from the energy sector went down by 12%. Now, the 2008 recession was part of this, but the experts at the Energy Information Administration tell us that the drive to deploy renewables, energy efficiency, and the switch from coal to natural gas were the bigger reasons. The critical takeaway is that our economic system is demonstrating its capacity to reduce emissions. So on to reason number 8. China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, is on the drive for cleaner energy. In those smoke-filled skylines in Beijing and Tianjin, they can see that it's just too dangerous to be completely dependent on coal to power their economic future. They've set up 7 cap-and-trade pilot programs in areas covering 250 million people in the country. In short, they recognize there's a need to act. They've reached out to experts, including the Environmental Defense Fund, the state of California, for technical assistance, and they are taking a whole series of unmistakable strides forward. Reason number 7 to be optimistic. Now, the United States is the world's second biggest emitter, and we are also moving to limit carbon pollution from our largest source, power plants. Our power plants in the United States emit more carbon dioxide than every other country's economy except for China. And until now, there have been no federal limits on the pollution. That's why the President's recent announcement of national carbon limits for power plants is so important. The Clean Power Plan will cut billions of tons of pollution and drive investment in clean energy. It will also encourage international actions from those countries that are waiting for the United States to act. And the proposed rules have been met with very strong public support. 2/3 of Americans support these rules, according to a recent poll from the Wall Street Journal. Reason number 6. President Obama has required big cuts in the greenhouse gas emissions from cars, doubling gas mileage from doubling the miles per gallon standard by 2025. Now, the public might have been expected to react with outrage. That's what some of our opponents might have predicted, but instead they reacted by buying more cars. Sales of cars have increased since 2009 by 1 million units per year, at the same time as the miles per gallon efficiency of these cars has gone up. And by the way, electric cars are now cool. Not environmentally cool, just plain old cool. Even people who don't care about the planet love to drive them. And that's important because although the numbers now are small, the numbers were small with tablet computers a while ago too. But when people are buying something because they want it, not because they think they should, that's the start of something big. And now on to the number 5 reason. We're starting to bring that same technological leap to our homes. Devices like the Nest thermostat give people control over energy use in their own lives. On a national scale, America is about to invest $2 trillion in remaking the electric grid in the next 2 decades. And with the right state policies, that can lead to a revolution to the way we create and consume power. Imagine living in a home that not only consumes clean energy, but generates it, can store it, and can sell it back to the grid. Imagine living in a home, as I visited recently in Austin, Texas, that has a monthly electric bill of just $3. Now that's a clean energy revolution that everybody can support. So the number 4 reason. Methane is 84 times more dangerous to our climate than carbon dioxide in the short run. Now, if that doesn't sound like a reason for optimism, you're looking at it the wrong way. Think of it like this. Here's a major contributor to climate change that we can fix at bargain prices. The cost? A penny. That's right, we can stop almost half the methane pollution at a cost per 1,000 feet of cubic gas of just 1 cent. The price would rise from $4.50 to $4.51. Right here in Colorado, we have the world's leading rules and the first rules on reducing methane leakage from our oil and gas wells. EDF was proud to work with Governor Hickenlooper to negotiate the proposed and now adopted rules with 3 major oil and gas companies. And given that methane causes about 30% of the climate pollution, the climate change that we're now seeing, and about 30% of what we expect to see, the stakes are very high. This is a great opportunity for climate progress nationwide, and the time for federal action is now. On to the number 3 reason to be optimistic about climate change. Politically, the future belongs to those who support climate action. 85% of voters under the age of 30 want limits on climate pollution from power plants, according to a recent poll by Stan Greenberg. I can't name another issue that enjoys the support of young people, 17 out of 20 young people. For both Democrats and Republicans, being on the right side of this issue is a matter of long-term political survival. And climate is increasingly an issue that defines a candidate. According to recent research, if you're seen as being a climate denier, it stamps you as being out of touch with young folks. Okay, we're down to the number 2 reason. We have a plan. So far, every year in our lives, global emissions of greenhouse gases has gone up. We need a plan to start bringing them down, not by 2050, but within the next 5 years. We need to get on track now. With our colleagues at the Nature Conservancy and other organizations, we found the greenhouse gas reductions we need to do just that. Cuts of 6 gigatons a year by 2020. That's a lot of carbon. It's enough to turn the corner toward climate stability. It's going to take a lot of work, but it can be done. Now, we've put these ideas together onto baseball cards that you might have seen around. And on these baseball cards are the stars from many organizations in many countries around the world. This is a global imperative, and people everywhere are stepping up. So finally, in the tradition of Letterman, I've saved the most important reason for last. The number 1 reason I'm certain that if we work at it, we can overcome this challenge is that the 2 largest emitting countries haven't yet adopted the most powerful tool that we have. It's a policy that dramatically cut acid rain, and that's cutting pollution now from Los Angeles to London. It's putting a price on pollution. It's just economics 101. When it's free to pollute, you get a lot of pollution. But when there's a price to pay, industry will have an incentive to find low-cost carbon solutions, and inventors, investors, and entrepreneurs will join the race. How do we achieve that price on carbon? Well, at EDF, we have our own preferred approaches. We believe nothing matches the efficiency and power of the marketplace. But the important thing is the end result. How much pollution is cut? The ability to harness the market is the number 1 reason I am optimistic we can solve climate change. And I believe the first 9 reasons, the successes that we're demonstrating in the real world, make it much more likely that we'll have the political will to put a price on carbon pollution. Okay, now that you're all persuaded, you probably want to know, how can I help? And I'm glad you asked. I believe we can take a page from the education reform movement. Back in 2009, in the Economic Recovery Act, the states were given a reason to rework their policies on education. And influential citizens, like you, pushed their legislatures and their governors to act. In 2014, President Obama, with the EPA power plant rule, has given states a reason to innovate their way to clean energy. And I urge all of you to join with us and people in your states to drive the states to policies on power generation that cut carbon pollution. Let your governor and your state legislators know that this really matters to you, because believe me, that really matters to them. Nothing will give Congress a greater push than state action, and nothing will create more international momentum than American leadership. So grab your newfound optimism and join us in the race of our lives. Thanks.
Okay, is it on? Yes, great. I'm Coral Davenport. I cover energy and climate policy with the New York Times. Thank you so much, Fred, for all of your notes of optimism. I'm now here to start asking harder questions about them. You talked about President Obama's EPA regulations on cars and power plants. There's no denying that these are the biggest steps any president has ever taken to combat carbon pollution, to combat climate change. But climate scientists say those steps are nowhere near what's necessary. They say, and the administration says this too, the regulations are enough to get US carbon pollution down, cut 17% from 2005 levels by 2020, which is what President Obama pledged in Copenhagen that he would do. He also pledged that the US would cut emissions 80% by 2050. And scientists say that's the real number, that's the most important number, that's the cut that gets us where we need to go. And they say these regulations absolutely cannot possibly achieve that 2050 level. They say at best, this is a first step. And that this administration isn't offering any more than that. And that you yourself said, we need to see really steep cuts really fast, as soon as 5 to 10 years. So we've got these strong regulations. They're politically controversial. We don't see the administration prepared to do anything else beyond that. So, how is it possible to think, this is a nice first step, but how is it possible to think that we're going to very quickly make even steeper cuts to get where we really need to go?
Well, no, I appreciate the realities of the situation, Coral, but the administration's plan, as you say, can, when implemented, get us to 2020, but then we have to do more beyond 2020, and the more we can do between now and 2020, the less we have to do later. But the administration is saying that they're considering more. You may have read, I'm sure you did read, the methane plan that they released, and they've said that they're going to consider and decide as soon as this summer or early fall whether they're going to regulate methane emissions. Methane emissions are 30% of our climate pollution problem, and there's something big that they could do. Adopting something like what we've done in Colorado nationwide would make a big dent additional to the two things that you've cited. What's possible in the states right now? In the Sunshine State in Florida, where the 10th most solar panels had been deployed. They were number 10 in deploying solar panels up until a couple of years ago. And last year they fell to 18th in the Sunshine State. Why? Because their rules, a tax on tangible property and other rules, prevent companies like Sunrun and Solar City from installing solar panels on my roof and paying for it, so I just have the convenience of not having the capital outlay and buying power from them, cheaper than I can buy it from the utilities. When those rules are changed, the deployment of solar panels will skyrocket in a place like Florida or North Carolina, which has similar obstacles in the path. So there's a lot more we can do. What the president does in the upcoming meeting in Paris in December 2015 will make a difference. So we will be watching and advocating and even pushing the president to commit the United States to more. So there's a whole series of things that are underway that I think matter. I'm not optimistic because I think the power plant rule and the car rule get us there. But these are building blocks like the civil rights legislation, one step at a time. And if we keep marching and our eye on the ball, how much the cuts are, when they're achieved, and aim for the biggest cuts as soon as possible, what I'm saying is we can get there.
So your number one reason for optimism, this is an interesting frame, is that the two largest carbon polluters in the world don't have a price on carbon. And thus, if they did, that could make a really big difference. I would like to remind you about, take you back through the political history of attempts to price carbon. During the Clinton administration, Vice President Al Gore urged House Democrats to take a vote. You remember the BTU tax, effectively a price on carbon pollution. That was a big contributor to Democrats losing the House in 1994. The Democrats that went out and took that vote got hammered by Republicans for supporting an energy tax. 10 years later, more than 10 years later, in 2010, Democrats essentially voted on the same thing, a cap and trade in the House, and in the 2009, they voted on that. 2010, in the Senate, the efforts to work on cap and trade, which you yourself had pushed very hard, worked very hard with Senator John McCain on, fell apart. Effectively, once again, it was viewed as a carbon tax. It was turned into political campaign attacks. Republicans and outside groups like Americans for Prosperity spent a lot of money going after not just Democrats who had voted for a price on carbon, but also targeting Republicans who even talked about climate change, let alone supported a carbon tax. This became something that is viewed on the Hill now as political poison, a political non-starter. It seems harder than ever, a greater lift than ever, to try to talk about pricing carbon. Why are you optimistic that this is politically possible?
Because, Coral, you have to, in Washington, the mentality is the political reality today is likely to be the political reality forever. And I've watched these issues long enough to know on an issue like freedom to marry, things can change on a dime. Once the politicians recognize that actually the sentiment is moving in the other direction, they switch their positions and find a way to do it. In 1984, I don't think the BTU tax, I do think it was damaging to the Democrats, no doubt about it. I don't think it was perceived as a price on carbon. I don't think the climate issue had really risen in the public consciousness then. I agree with you about our recent efforts to pass Waxman-Markey. That was, but even there, we now have a series of Republicans beyond the headlines starting to talk about energy policy and even climate. In the last few weeks, Rob Portman joined a group of conservative political leaders convened under the auspices of the Conservation Leadership Council that EDF helped start. This is a group that includes the former Secretary of Interior in the George W. Bush administration, Gail Norton, the former Secretary of Agriculture and former Governor of North Dakota, Ed Schaefer, Lynn Scarlett, also high up in the Department of Interior in the Bush administration, Jim Connaughton, who was President Bush's environmental and climate advisor. These folks are all starting to talk about ideas and ways that you can keep your Republican credentials, but be on the right side of solving this problem. So that hasn't bubbled into lots of news stories. Maybe you can do something about that. But it is happening because of the demographics. When young folks want action on climate, And when people are ahead of the politicians will change. There's no doubt in my mind. The question is, will they change soon enough, and how soon? And that's our job, to accelerate that change.
I do write about Republicans and climate change, and in there's something to the dynamic that you just described. It's absolutely true that there are a significant number of influential Republican thinkers, economists, former cabinet officials, folks like economist Greg Mankiw, who advised the Romney campaign, folks like economist Doug Holtz-Eakin, who advised
Chief policy person in the McCain
for
campaign.
the McCain
Hank
campaign.
Paulson, who just came out for a carbon tax.
Sure, Art Laffer, senior economist in the Reagan administration. These are all prominent Republicans who are very open about the need for some kind of carbon pricing policy. They urge lawmakers to take action on it. But you see a divide between Republicans who are thinkers and economists and former officials and Republicans who actually have to run for office, Republicans who have to run in primaries, Republicans who have signed Grover Norquist's anti-tax pledge to never raise taxes. And when I talk to them or when I talk to their staffs, they say, that's all well and good that these gray-bearded wise men are talking about this. They don't have to run for office. They don't have to face these super PACs. The difference. Can you talk about that? And I'm interested especially if you can talk about Republican lawmakers, elected officials who have to face voters, who have to face these campaigns, who are thinking about changing on this and feel like it might be safe to do that.
Absolutely. There's definitely a need for those of us in the environmental community to show that this is an election issue that can help Republicans get elected, not hurt them in their own primaries. And there's a need to show that denying climate science and being against action, on the other hand, will hurt them if they do that, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. Now you have a handful of congressmen and senators who are talking about the climate issue beyond Rob Portman on the Republican side. Lindsey Graham has talked about clean energy. Susan Collins.
Just won a primary.
Just won a primary and avoided a runoff. Mm-hmm. Susan Collins last week introduced a bill on climate pollutants in Maine. There's similarly several Republicans in the House who voted against the effort to stop EPA's action on power plants. So there are a handful. We have to grow that handful, and I think the best way we're going to do that is by demonstrating, hey, if we could get 100,000 young voters in Colorado to pledge that they'll come out to vote in November for candidates that support climate action, and if we can turn those people out, you bet politicians will take notice.
So here's another pushback that I hear very specifically on that is I talk to campaign strategists and they say young voters are the hardest group to turn out. When you see, and the young voters who care about this issue now will be voters in their 30s and 40s in 10 or 15 or 20 years. But right now, campaign strategists say it's hard, that's the hardest group to turn out, and it's hard to turn out voters specifically just on the issue of climate change, that it doesn't move people in the same way that abortion does or the same way that immigration does. Can you talk about that?
I think that is the narrative so far. I think you're exactly right. I think a lot of young voters turned out for President Obama, who was an exciting presidential candidate. That's why we have this opportunity in the midterm elections, and EDF now has a C4 and has a PAC, and we will be working on this here in Colorado and other places. We have the opportunity to show that we can boost turnout in a midterm election where they normally don't, and we can statistically demonstrate that they'll turn out for candidates who are declared good on climate, whether they're Democrat or Republican.
I'm going to switch a little. I want to talk about the issue of adaptation. For many years, environmental groups have resisted the idea of really creating a big conversation around adaptation, around the idea that these climate crises, these devastating climate crises are coming, and we have to start preparing for them now. It was viewed, a lot of environmental groups said, let's not talk about that. That's sort of viewed as, that assumes we're going to fail. That assumes we're not going to get where we need to go. And it also, it offers the sense that we're giving up. We're not going to put our resources into stopping this problem. Instead, we've given up on that and going to put resources into just living in this new risky and frightening world. But the recent scientific studies signal that a global temperature rise of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, sort of not quite tipping point, but the point at which we see major melting of the polar ice caps, the point at which we see really rapid sea level rise, the point at which a lot of land no longer is arable. The most recent IPCC reports signaled that it's very hard to imagine that that world is not going to reach us. The amount of carbon that you have to stop being emitted from the global economy, that you would have to pull the brakes on so hard and so fast that it's really not realistic to expect that we're going to hit that, and that it's economic folly to not start planning for this. Talk about that tension, and if there's kind of a shift in thinking among environmentalists about this.
Well, I think you're exactly right, Coral, and it's why you're a journalist working for the New York Times, is because what you've observed is real. There has been or had been a reluctance in the environmental community to talk about adaptation. I think we're over that. I think there is a recognition that we're already seeing the effects. We're already seeing bigger storms, and sea level has already risen. So we're seeing more destruction from the hurricanes that do hit. So there's got to be adaptation. I think this can be helpful to us to get people to understand that the problem is here and now and not 100 years away, that we have to think about it now. And I think the best sorts of adaptation is going to be resilience. Resilience is not only planning to protect communities like New Orleans, but doing it in a way that lowers carbon emissions. So when you build wetlands back up in front of New Orleans, south of New Orleans, you cut down the speed of the hurricane, and you also are sequestering carbon. So I think about especially approaches that do both. Thinking about making the grid so that when you lose power in New York, as we did the recent hurricane, we don't go dark entirely, but there's a series of microgrids. And by the way, with a series of microgrids, you can keep using solar panels, so it gives somebody a reason to have solar panels instead of a backup diesel generator, lowering carbon pollution and making the community more resilient. So I think you will see that conversation started. The last thing I would say, though, on that is what's realistic if you project current trends is one thing. The power of the market to harness entrepreneurs is incredible. We've seen it with acid rain. We've seen it in California with the Global Warming Solutions Act. And if you watch the places around the world that are doing this, they're also cutting carbon much faster than you might have imagined. So I think what's possible once you have that policy in place, a little hard to envision, but it's going to happen a lot faster. I mean, the complaints about the European Union cap-and-trade system are that the price is too low. Well, what that means is they're cutting carbon too fast. So you can fix that by having the political will to bring down the cap. The market can do magical things if we let it.
I'm going to talk about international negotiations. No matter how much the U.S. cuts on its own, it doesn't make a difference unless other major economies cut. You said you're very optimistic about what's happening in China. The new leadership has, as you said, set up these pilot cap-and-trade programs. There's talk of a peak year of emissions. It does seem that there are some things changing on the ground in China, changing in the thinking in Beijing. But for now, China is still the largest polluter. Its emissions are on track to continue rising, and millions of impoverished Chinese are going to be rising into the middle class. They're going to start driving. They're going to get access to electricity. A lot of that electricity is going to come from coal. The story in India is the same, where emissions are projected to double or even triple in the coming decades. There, new administration, new leadership seems very focused on pro-development, pro-growth, not sending a lot of signals that they're interested in committing to carbon cuts as a developing nation. Other economies, Vladimir Putin of Russia, on the record as questioning the science of climate change at all. This is not a priority for him. So how realistic is it? The UN has been trying to get this treaty for over 20 years, and time and again it's failed. How realistic is it that this is going to come together in sort of the treaty that's talked about, given, and these are just a few dynamics?
Well, look, there's no question that we failed to have the treaty we need in the world, and there's no question it's really hard to get 180 nations to agree on anything. But the international process has produced tangible gains that I think are going to continue, and the international talks have been very important. The Clean Development Mechanism demonstrated ways for nations to economically cooperate and cut emissions in a way that's important. The whole concept of tropical deforestation and reducing it has advanced a lot. Brazil has cut its emissions from the destruction of rainforests by 70%. China is on track to reduce the carbon intensity in its economy by 45% as it's pledged. So, and I think what we see from the new administration, both in China and India, let's wait a little bit, because they're so new in India and so new in China. I am absolutely convinced that they are moving in a big way. Russia may be a more challenging story.
Mm-hmm. You talked about how President Obama needs to go to Paris in 2015 and be a central figure, be a leader in striking some kind of deal or agreement or treaty. This is another story that we've read before. Vice President Al Gore went to Kyoto in 1997, was a key figure in forging a treaty, pledged that the U.S. would cut its own emissions. Meanwhile, back home, the Senate had already voted that it was not going to ratify such a treaty. And so the U.S. never participated in Kyoto, really kind of gutting the effect of that. There's no reason to think that the current U.S. Senate is going to achieve a 2/3 vote necessary to ratify such a treaty, especially since this is going to come after 2015, when we could very likely have a majority Republican Senate, or certainly more Republicans than we have now. I noticed a couple of months ago the Senate refused to ratify a treaty on global disability. They couldn't even come to agreement on that. So given that reality, given that political reality, what can Obama do if he goes and says, well, we're going to have a treaty? How do you put that together with the reality on the ground and the fact that the rest of the world knows this now? They've seen this film before.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is, the president did go to Copenhagen. Copenhagen didn't produce a strong treaty, but the president went and he pledged 17% reductions. Other countries went and pledged reductions. And many of these countries, including the United States, are meeting the reductions they pledged without the Senate ever having taken up the issue. So I think we can go to Paris, and I think pledges matter, and I think a strong pledge from the United States is useful, even if the prospects of the Senate ratifying it are uncertain. But I would absolutely encourage the president to be consulting with the Senate between now and Paris, and be working to bring as many senators in both parties along. That's the way our most successful arms control treaties have been negotiated. And the president should be doing this between now and Paris as well, absolutely. I think, Paris can stand for progress, even if it doesn't result in a strong agreement among 180 nations on goals that are going to be ratified by the Senate. If it adds to an accountability structure on what counts as carbon emissions, on how there's going to be monitoring and verification. So there's ways that the international conversation about this issue moves us forward, even if we don't get the Senate to act. Would I rather have the Senate act? Absolutely, and we've got to work to change the political dialogue with the work with young people and otherwise to bring about a day soon when the Senate can act. But I recognize it's not likely in the next couple years.
Okay, last question, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. So if you have questions, you can start preparing them, and we'll have people with mics in the room. Policy prescription for the next president. Someone gets elected in 2016. You advocates, scientists are saying something needs to happen fast. What do they go in with? What should they do?
Well, number one, I think, is the number one reason. They need to come up with a plan that can be widely supported by Republicans and Democrats to cap carbon, have reductions, put a price on carbon. And there's enough moving pieces here in the economy that, I think that is really the essential ingredient in the next administration to get the cuts we need. Yeah.
All right. Do you want to go ahead and move to questions? There's one right here.
Should I wait for the microphone?
Yes. No, actually, please do wait for the microphone because the session is being live streamed, so we need to get your voice for everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Very informative. So my question is about geoengineering. How do you think that is working for climate, or is it helping? You're familiar with geoengineering, I'm sure.
Yeah. There's been a lot of proposals to mess with the planet and figure out ways to soak carbon into the oceans faster or divert sunlight through sulfate particles in the atmosphere. And we don't really have a system of governance to figure out who can shoot off what bag of sulfate particles into the atmosphere. So a lot of these things I find very worrisome. And yet, to sit around and pretend like somebody isn't going to want to go forward with these probably isn't realistic. So the Environmental Defense Fund is working with other scientific societies, and other organizations to put in place a set of rules about if someone wants to even pose an experiment on geoengineering, what would be the criteria to make sure that we're not all running the risk of someone tampering with the geophysics of our planet?
How do we bring more awareness to that?
That's a question, I think, for Coral.
I mean, geoengineering, so far, I just don't think I've ever written about geoengineering. I don't take it very seriously. I think that, as Fred says, though, it's unwise to completely ignore this because in the coming years we are going to see, I'll start paying attention to it when government policy starts incenting it. And as we start to see higher levels of CO2, as we, failures to pull the brakes as quickly as necessary, we may see some governments starting to incent it. But that'll be really weird when that happens.
Let's hope we don't get to that point.
But I mean, the conversation is out there. I have yet to see it really emerging in a major sort of government-sponsored way. But when that happens, we'll be writing about it. There's a question up front.
First, thank you for EDF. It's the best. It's fabulous. I'm a supporter and I love it all.
Thank you for your
Everything
support.
you do is excellent. My question is, do you think that fracking and the strong production of natural gas is going to really delay the development of green technologies? And the second part is, how can the environmental community spread the message that the development of green technologies and a carbon tax will not be a job killer, it might actually be a job creator?
Those are great questions, and thank you, Constance, for your support of EDF and the nice words. There's no question that the abundance of natural gas in the United States, its development, and the lower price of natural gas poses problems for coal, nuclear, wind, solar, every other form of energy. And it's brought great benefits to the United States economy, lower electricity prices, jobs. So in spite of the fact that it makes it harder for clean energy, we have to recognize and acknowledge there have been economic benefits. But it does make it harder. The good news is, while the price of wind has dropped a lot and is expected to drop some, the price of solar has dropped dramatically and is expected to drop a lot, and the price of storage is now dropping a lot. So I am hopeful, especially when you put a price on carbon, that solar can outcompete, and even where you don't, with storage, it may be able to outcompete. I think the California story of dramatically lowering their carbon emissions, a lot of that through energy efficiency, but also renewables, and being an engine of economic growth, maybe is the best way for that case study to let people know that these policies, rebuilding our energy infrastructure, is a job creator, not a job killer.
And there's a question back here in this row.
Am I hearing that the thing that's keeping the politicians to vote against CO2 is more the PACs than people in general? I mean, I thought that's what you were implying.
No, I didn't. Those politicians who don't take leadership positions, or the positions I'd like to see them take on climate, have a variety of motivations. But certainly there is a huge effort from the industries that benefit from not having limits on carbon, the coal lobby, to support politicians who share their perspective.
I would add to that. I mean, the PACs and outside groups that I talk to, the big one is Americans for Prosperity. The other groups that are funded by Koch Industries, another one called American Energy Alliance that gets funding from them, are quite clear on this. Their objective is to ensure that any Republican who supports climate policy or talks about climate change as a real problem linked to carbon pollution will lose primaries. I mean, that is their stated goal. President of Americans for Prosperity told me that. I've quoted him on that several times. We want to make sure those Republicans will lose their primaries. And so Republicans moderate Republicans who in the past had been very comfortable about talking about climate change, recognizing that it's a problem, have just shut down on it. They might not have gone all the way over to being vocal deniers of the science, but it just means they're not going to talk about it. They're certainly not going to endorse policy. I think the reason you see more openness in the Senate is because senators have 6 years between elections. Lindsey Graham, just won a primary. He has 6 years. He has time to, get involved in a climate or carbon tax deal if he wants to. There's time for the political storm to weather. In the House, they have to run every 2 years. You say something and the PACs remember it and they go after you. So I would say that, based on my reporting, that is a very strong and clear part of the landscape. And then there's a question over here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I must tell you I appreciate your optimism presentation because it actually affected me. I was sitting here realizing that some years ago I was very enthusiastic about the subject, and somehow along the way it fell off my priority list, and just hearing you I start writing things down again. So there is something to that optimism. I just wanted to let you know.
Good.
My question is around the cost. Have you done anything about analyzing, let's say today, if you had a magic wand, you could do all the things on your plan, what would it cost per person to get us to 80%, assuming that the entrepreneurial energy wasn't there? Like, this would be the worst case. Do you have a sense of, is that going to cost us $100 a person, $1,000, $10,000? How big is this if we actually just did it? Is it as bad as we may think it is?
The best studies of this that I know of have all been, compiled and looked at by an economist on our staff, Nat Cohen, and the predictions are that the GDP in America grows by a couple of % a year, out for the next 20, 30 years. And, at worst case, this reduces GDP growth not by many % per year, but by cumulatively over all those years by maybe 1%, 1.5%. So worst case, assuming no technological innovation, there is a very small cost. But the problem with all these models is they assume technology stands still. They don't know how to predict the lower price of solar. So best case, the lie that we can't have clean air and we can't reduce pollution and have a thriving economy, just as that's proved to be false in the case of acid rain, in the case of cleaning up coal-fired power plants and mercury of other pollutants, it will surely be false here.
Fred, I have a question about that, and I've looked at I've looked at Nat's analyses, and they match up with analyses done by Bill Nordhaus at Yale, analyses CBO has done similar analysis, but is it fair to say that the economic costs, even if they're amortized 1 or 2% over decades, hit unevenly? If you're pricing fossil fuels, the biggest polluter is coal. At the end of the day, you're probably putting coal out of work, putting coal miners out of work. There are pockets of the country where coal mining is central to the economy. They're not diversified. There's nothing else there. I think there's only about 80,000 coal miners working today in the U.S., but in the parts of the country where they work, there isn't anything else in the economy. I think it's fair to say that even though it's a small percentage, it's unevenly distributed. There will be big winners, but there will be places in the economy where people will lose, where there will be economic hurt, and it will be disproportionate to how it's felt in the rest of the economy.
That's not only fair to say, Coral, but maybe against my own interests, I'll bolster your point. In a state like Indiana, where 95% of the electricity is generated from coal, if you demand clean energy and put a price on carbon, then in the current energy mix, they're going to pay a lot more than residents in Oregon and Washington. So any policy, that's true, and any policy like this that prices carbon has to leave Indiana whole. Because otherwise, politically, it's not going to get support of the people there or their representatives. So we can't simply ignore those distributional effects. Your point is fair. I've strengthened it. And when we construct policy, we need to do it in a way with the people of Indiana,
And
not
Kentucky.
and Kentucky and Ohio. Not construct policy for them, but do it with them in a way that gives them a cleaner economy and keeps them whole.
Okay, a couple more questions. There's one over here.
Could you talk a little bit about the automobile? We have millions of cars in the United States and California, where I come from. I don't know how many cars there are. The electric car is becoming more popular, but is there anything that can be done technologically or mechanically which can do something to reduce the pollution provided by the cars that we now have and the ones that will be manufactured in the near future?
Cars have become much, much, much cleaner than ever before, and the new rules that Obama put in place in 2009, the new miles per gallon standards, mean that they will become much, much cleaner over the next 10 years. We can do even more than that because we have cars today that already meet the 2025 standards. So there is more we can do to lightweight cars, make them out of aluminum, make the engine block itself out of aluminum. All of that means you require less combustion to move the car.
Well, what I'm thinking about more is there anything that can be done with the petroleum itself
Well, in terms of carbon dioxide, the only thing that could be done there would be to find an effective way that respects land use constraints and biological resources to use a biofuel. And I'm not sure that there is a way. You don't want to consume lots of land to grow gasoline, basically.
Okay, so we have time for one last question, and there's one over here.
Is EDF doing much work on carbon capture and sequestration? I mean, it may not ultimately be a solution for us, but if we could do it, it could certainly be a big help to China in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yes, if you're going to burn coal or even natural gas into the future, you have to sequester the carbon. We have worked on that. Scott Anderson in our Texas office is our resident expert. We have to come up with rules to make sure that if it's allowed and if credit is given to it under any sort of carbon cap and trade or carbon tax system, you've got to make sure that where it's put, it stays. And so he's been involved in an EPA policy-making process over the past few years to get those rules right.
Okay, and on that note, set to wrap up. Fred, thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you.